The whole cafe went silent when Chase Rourke tipped his cup and sent hot coffee across Jonah Vale's worn jacket, a single father with a battered briefcase nobody had looked at twice. Chase laughed, called the man a broke nobody who had wandered in off the street, and made sure CEO Vivian Blackwood was watching. Jonah did not raise his voice. He blotted the stain, opened the briefcase, and tore the signature page of a $600 million authorization cleanly in half. Vivian lurched to her feet. Before Chase could speak, the CEO addressed the quiet man by a title that made the whole cafe hold its breath. If you want to watch arrogance pay its full price, stay with this story until the very end. Jonah Vale arrived at Bellweather Café 30 minutes before his scheduled appointment, the way he always did when a meeting carried real weight, because being early gave a man time to read a room before the room tried to read him. The cafe occupied the entire ground floor of Blackwood Crown Hospitality's flagship property, a sweeping space of exposed brick and brass fixtures that still carried the bones of something much older beneath the polished surfaces the renovation crew had layered over them. Jonah wore the same dark jacket he wore to every professional engagement. The leather briefcase he carried had belonged to his father and showed it, and if anyone had studied the careful way he moved through the cafe, pausing near the espresso machine, tilting his head, listening, they might have recognized the habit of a man whose entire career had been built on noticing what other people walked right past. Nobody studied him. At 42, Jonah Vale had the kind of face that did not announce itself, the kind of quiet that people in expensive suits tended to read as emptiness, and he had long since stopped being surprised by that particular mistake. The cafe's head manager, Miles Fenwick, was behind the counter fighting with a pressure valve on the primary espresso machine when Jonah set his briefcase on a stool and leaned over to look, asking without preamble whether the steam had been cycling too fast or too slow all morning. Miles blinked at him. This stranger in the worn jacket had just described the exact problem in one sentence, and before Miles could answer, Jonah had already identified the valve, turned it a quarter rotation counterclockwise with a simple tool from his jacket pocket, and brought the machine back into rhythm. The whole exchange took less than 3 minutes, cost nothing, and solved a problem the morning crew had been tolerating since 6 o'clock. Miles was grateful in the genuine, uncomplicated way of a man who had worked the same counter for 20 years and knew the difference between a person who helped because it was easy and one who helped because they could not pass something broken without stopping. He was still thanking Jonah when the side entrance opened, and Chase Rourke walked in. Chase Rourke was 36 years old, Vice President of Development for Blackwood Crown, and he wore his authority the way certain men wear cologne, applied too heavily, impossible to ignore, designed to announce his presence before he fully entered a room. He had arrived ahead of CEO Vivian Blackwood to arrange the seating for what his calendar described as a landmark investor briefing, the kind of gathering that preceded the public announcement of a $600 million redevelopment project that would reshape the city's oldest commercial corridor. Chase took one look at Jonah Vale, the jacket, the briefcase, the hand resting casually on the bar stool in what Chase had designated a VIP staging area, and made the calculation quickly and without any particular cruelty, the way someone instinctively swats a fly not out of malice, but because the fly simply does not belong in that space. He crossed the room, stopped 2 feet from Jonah, and told him in a voice built for conference rooms that the area was reserved for guests of the building's executive floor. Jonah turned on the stool and said, without shifting his tone at all, that he had a 9 o'clock appointment with Vivian Blackwood. Chase looked from the scuffed shoes to the worn briefcase to the coffee-stained jacket, and then looked back at the man's face with an expression that had nothing to do with uncertainty. He was not questioning whether Jonah was telling the truth. He was simply establishing, for anyone watching, that the truth did not matter when delivered by a person who looked the way Jonah looked. He asked, loud enough that two nearby tables could hear, what a person like that could possibly bring to a CEO meeting that would not just be a waste of her time. Miles opened his mouth, and Chase's eyes moved to him with the particular flat stillness of someone accustomed to silencing subordinates without raising a finger, and Miles closed his mouth. Jonah did not argue. He did not pull out his phone, did not reach for his briefcase, did not attempt to prove anything to a man who had already decided what he was going to believe. He simply turned back to his coffee and waited. The table near the far window had been reserved under the name J. Vale. Vivian's assistant had placed a small card on it that morning. Chase crossed to it, picked up the card, turned it over in his fingers, and set it face down on a nearby empty table, as though it had been placed there by mistake. Then he looked at Jonah and said the sentence that would cost him everything. This table is for people who decide the future of this city, not for someone who fixes the plumbing. The cafe door opened behind Chase's back, and Vivian Blackwood walked in with her legal counsel, Evelyn Shaw, and two members of the board, and Chase still did not know that the man he had just dismissed by name, J. Vale, was the only person in the building whose signature could allow the future of the city to move forward at all. Vivian Blackwood moved through public spaces the way water moves through a channel, efficiently, without resistance, finding the fastest line between where she was and where she needed to be. She was 38, CEO of a company that had been in her family since her grandfather broke ground on the original Blackwood Crown in 1963, and she carried that history in the way she occupied a room. Not arrogance exactly, but a settled authority that communicated. She had never seriously had to question her right to be at the center of any table she chose. She spotted Chase immediately, registered the posture of self-congratulation he wore when he had been managing something in her absence, and began moving toward the reserved table when she noticed, without immediately processing, the man sitting quietly at the bar with a jacket that did not match the room. Jonah rose and introduced himself, extending his hand, and Chase moved smoothly between them and told Vivian, with the practiced ease of someone who had done this particular maneuver many times before, that the gentleman at the counter had wandered in off the street and had been causing a disruption. The word he used was disruption, which was accurate only in the sense that Jonah's presence disrupted Chase's preferred version of events. Vivian looked at Jonah. She had seen the name J. Vale in every document connected to the Bellweather Covenant for the past 8 months, but her legal team had always handled the correspondence, and she had formed, without ever examining the assumption, an image of a much older man with a formal representative and an office full of mahogany furniture. The person standing in front of her did not match that image, and in the fraction of a second it took her to reconcile them. Chase filled the silence. He reached into his pocket and placed several folded bills on the bar in front of Jonah, the gesture slow enough to be theatrical, and told him in a tone of performed generosity that if the man was short on breakfast money, there was no shame in it. Several staff members found things to study on the floor. 2 guests at a nearby table exchanged a look but said nothing. The particular silence of people who did not want to become involved with someone who clearly had institutional power on his side. Vivian said Chase's name once, quietly, with the beginnings of a correction forming in her voice, but she said it too softly and too late, and Chase, who had learned years ago to take the measure of a CEO's early silences, recognized this one as the kind that would not harden into a command. Not yet, not in public, not in front of investors. He interpreted it correctly as permission to continue. Jonah looked at the money on the bar for a long moment, then looked up at Chase, then past Chase to Vivian, and asked in a voice that carried out being raised whether this was the standard by which Blackwood Crown chose to treat a person when it assumed they had nothing left to offer in return. Vivian did not answer. Chase laughed. A real laugh, not performed, because to him the question was genuinely absurd, and told the room that men like Jonah Vail did not belong at the table where decisions of this scale were made. He was still laughing when Jonah asked him to repeat that sentence. Chase, wanting the room to see him at his full height in front of the CEO, obliged. He said it slower, with more precision. Men like Jonah did not belong at this table, full stop. Jonah nodded once, the way a man nods when a test has returned exactly the result he expected, and reached for the briefcase. He said, "Then I suppose there's no reason to continue the meeting." He set the briefcase on the bar, unlatched it, and began to open it. The document Jonah placed on the bar was enclosed in a dark green folder, bearing a raised silver seal, and before it was fully open, Evelyn Shaw had already crossed half the distance between the door and the counter, because she had spent the better part of 8 months reviewing every piece of paper associated with the Bellweather Preservation Covenant, and she knew that seal the way a surgeon knows a scalpel. By shape, weight, and what it could cut. The seal was the Covenant's original certification mark, registered with the city's land records office in 1974, and the document inside was the final authorization that Blackwood Crown had been waiting for since the development project cleared its last regulatory hearing. Without it, the redevelopment could not legally break ground. Without it, the primary construction lender had the right to freeze disbursements. Without it, the project's insurance carrier had already signaled, in careful legal language, that it would decline to bind coverage on any structural work touching the property's original foundation. Vivian was on her feet before the folder was fully open. She recognized the seal, she recognized the letterhead, and she had been waiting for this moment with more professional anxiety than she had allowed herself to show for the better part of a year. Chase was still smiling, watching what he assumed was a confused old errand he would sort out in the next 30 seconds. Jonah turned to the last page of the document, where his signature sat above the raised notary stamp that confirmed his authority as the Covenant's legal administrator, and he looked at it for exactly the length of time it took Chase to open his mouth to speak again. Then Jonah tore the page cleanly in half. The sound was a small one, paper in a quiet room, but it landed in the cafe the way a single note lands in a concert hall when every other instrument has stopped. The halves of the signature page sat on the bar, and nobody moved. Chase's expression did not immediately change, because his mind had not yet caught up to what his eyes were processing, and in that half-second gap, Vivian Blackwood said Jonah's full name and title in the voice she reserved for situations that had moved beyond managing. She said, "Mr. Jonah Vail, the administrator of the Bellweather Preservation Covenant." The words were not an introduction. They were a correction of her own assumption of Chase's performance, of the last 40 minutes of a morning that had gone catastrophically sideways in a direction nobody in that room except Jonah had been able to see coming. Evelyn Shaw reached the bar, looked at the two halves of the signature page, and explained to the room in the flat, precise tone of a lawyer delivering facts that prefer not to be mistaken for opinions. without a valid authorization from the covenant's administrator. The $600 million project could not proceed. The primary lender had a contractual right to halt all disbursements, and the city's Historic Preservation Board had grounds to issue a stop-work order that no amount of lobbying would dissolve in under 18 months. Chase's face went through 3 expressions in the space of 2 seconds: confusion, dismissal, and then, arriving late, something that might have been the first stirring of alarm. He reached for the torn page as though physical possession of the pieces would undo what had happened. Jonah picked up both halves and returned them to the briefcase without any particular urgency. Vivian asked if they could move this discussion to a private conference room. Jonah said no. He said Chase had chosen to make the situation public, which meant everyone present had a right to hear what came next. Then he reached back into the briefcase and placed a single photograph on the bar. A close-up of the building's old foundation, taken during an inspection, showing a series of precision cuts in the original masonry that did not appear in any licensed contractor report. He looked at Chase and asked, in the same level voice he had used for everything that morning, whether Chase would prefer to explain those cuts himself, or whether he would rather wait for the city's structural inspection authority to explain them. Chase did not answer the question about the foundation. He did the thing men in his position tend to do when confronted with a specific fact they cannot immediately explain. He elevated the register of the conflict, turning a question about masonry cuts into a charge of extortion, addressing Vivian rather than Jonah, as though the simplest way to make the evidence disappear was to discredit the person holding it. He said Jonah was attempting to use an obscure historical covenant to extract either money or a position from the company, that the torn authorization was a threat rather than an exercise of legitimate legal authority, and that a smart CEO would recognize a shakedown when it was performed in front of her own board members. Vivian listened without expression, which Chase read again as the early silence he had learned to exploit. Jonah let Chase finish. Then he said, without raising his voice, that he had not asked for money, had not asked for a position, and had not asked for anything that was not already required by the covenant his grandfather had registered 49 years ago. What he had found, during the final structural inspection he was legally required to complete before signing the authorization, was that the foundation data in Chase's official project report did not match the censored data collected by the building's own monitoring system. Chase's report described the original masonry as critically compromised, the language chosen with sufficient precision to make the restoration option appear both dangerous and cost-prohibitive, which left the demolition option as the only rational choice. Actual sensor readings from the building's embedded monitors told a different story. The foundation was stable, the historic masonry was load-bearing, and the demolition Chase had been advocating was not necessary. It was, however, profitable, specifically for Rourke Urban Works, a demolition and excavation company whose ownership traced through 3 shell entities to a private investment vehicle in which Chase held a significant and undisclosed interest. Vivian's face did not change because she had been trained since childhood to keep her face from changing in rooms full of people who were watching it for information. But something behind her eyes shifted, and Evelyn Shaw, who had worked with Vivian long enough to read those small shifts, put down her pen. Vivian turned to Chase and said, quietly, that she would need him to leave the cafe. Chase did not leave. He said that Vivian was making the kind of decision that people in her position regretted when the quarterly numbers arrived. and that a single father with a freelance consulting license was not a credible challenge to the structural engineering reports his department had commissioned from 3 separate firms. He said this in front of her board members, in front of Miles, in front of the guests who were no longer pretending to look elsewhere, and the calculation behind it was as clear as it was old. The man's poverty was the argument, and the company's resources were the evidence. Then Vivienne made the offer she would later describe as her most expensive mistake of the year. She offered Jonah a cash settlement, a clean, immediate buyout of the Covenant's administrative rights, structured as a consulting engagement to avoid the appearance of a forced transaction, at a number that was significantly more money than Jonah would earn in 3 years of independent work. It was the kind of offer that assumed the other person's ceiling was defined by their current financial floor, and it failed completely because Jonah Vale was not there about money. He said so without any bitterness, without any performance of injured pride. He said the number on the table was not the issue. The issue was what Chase had done to the people who had been in this building before the renovation plans arrived. The small business owners who had been pressured out of their leases, the employees who had filed complaints that disappeared into Chase's inbox, the structural record that had been altered to serve a private financial interest. Vivienne sat with that for a moment, and in the silence, she understood what Jonah was actually assessing. He was not only examining the conduct of her vice president, he was examining hers. Jonah said he would reconsider signing the authorization under 4 conditions. Chase would be suspended pending an independent investigation. A third-party structural engineering firm would audit the foundation. The contracts connected to Rourke Urban Works would be disclosed in full, and any employee who had been threatened or coerced would be given a protected channel to come forward without fear of retaliation. Vivienne agreed to the first 3 without hesitation and paused on the 4th. The pause lasted 4 seconds, but 4 seconds in a room that quiet carries weight. She was calculating the board's response to an open whistleblower provision, and Jonah, who had been watching people make calculations for 20 years, recognized the arithmetic immediately. He stood, picked up his briefcase, and walked toward the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame and said, without turning around, "Your hesitation just told me more than the coffee did." Chase Rourke's counterattack began within the hour and was executed with the efficiency of someone who had prepared contingencies. He reached out to 3 business journalists who had previously written favorable coverage of the company's development pipeline and offered them a version of events in which a disgruntled freelance consultant, unemployed, financially precarious, raising a teenage daughter alone on project fees, was using a dormant preservation clause to hold 1,000 job development hostage over a personal grievance. The narrative required no fabrication of facts, only the careful selection of which facts to present. Jonah's modest income, his independent contractor status, the worn jacket, the old briefcase, the coffee stain on his sleeve, all of it arranged into a portrait of a man whose motivations were economic envy, dressed up as legal principle. The photograph that circulated showed Jonah mid-motion, the coffee already spreading across his jacket, framed in a way that cropped Chase's hand from the image entirely. Chase did not mention, in any of these conversations, that he had been holding the cup. 3 members of Blackwood Crown's board of directors received private calls from Chase's father, who sat on 2 of their other boards, suggesting that the situation required a swift resolution and that swift resolutions, in Chase's experience, generally involved the company demonstrating it had resources to outlast any opposition. This was not a threat, it was a statement of actuarial fact, delivered by a man who had been making such statements for 40 years and had rarely found them disputed. Jonah Vale's financial situation was not difficult to assess. He had a daughter in high school, a mortgage on a modest house, no institutional backing, and legal exposure if Blackwood chose to challenge his authority under the covenant on technical grounds. The company had 12 lawyers. Jonah had one retainer agreement with a solo practitioner who handled his real estate paperwork. Jonah received one phone call from Lila that evening. Between reading over the foundation sensor data at his kitchen table and reviewing the photos he had taken in the archive room 6 weeks earlier, she asked him how the day had gone, and he gave her an honest answer that didn't include the coffee or Chase or the board or the money that had been left on the bar, like a tip for a service he hadn't performed. She asked him only whether he was doing what he thought was right. He said sometimes doing what was right was the more expensive option, and she said she knew that, and then she said she trusted him. And they talked for a few more minutes about something that had nothing to do with Blackwood Crown. And when he set the phone down, he sat with the foundation photographs for a long time before he got up to make dinner. Miles Fenwick came to Jonah's office the following morning with a flash drive and an expression that had the particular tension of a man who had been deciding something difficult for a long time and had finally reached the edge of the decision. He sat across the desk and told Jonah that Chase had visited the cafe the previous year and presented Miles with a voluntary lease termination agreement, explaining that the cafe would be demolished regardless, and that signing voluntarily would net Miles a more favorable exit package than waiting. When Miles declined, Chase had told him, in an email that Miles had kept and never sent to anyone, that he would ensure the cafe's next food safety inspection found grounds for a provisional closure. Miles had the email. He had never shown it to anyone, because he had been certain, with the logic of a man who had watched the powerful move through his cafe for 2 decades, that he was a single witness against a vice president, and that no outcome from that math worked in his favor. Jonah did not push him. He did not tell Miles what to do with the email. He said only that Chase had survived this long because each person he had damaged had believed they were the only one. And that isolation was not a fact about the situation, it was a tactic. Chase appeared on a business news segment 2 days after the cafe incident and called Jonah a tradesman who had confused an administrative footnote with a seat at a real boardroom table. Evelyn Shaw sent Jonah a message at 11:47 that night. She had found, while auditing the covenant-related digital files, an electronic authorization bearing Jonah's signature, dated 3 months before the cafe meeting, granting approval for the initial demolition phase. Jonah had never signed it. Evelyn met Jonah at 7 the following morning, in a conference room she had reserved under a pretext, and she brought the electronic document on a secured tablet and set it in front of him without preamble. The signature was his, pulled, with enough technical care to pass a basic visual review, from a digitized copy of a preservation compliance letter Jonah had filed with the city 4 years earlier. Whoever had created the document had access to Blackwood Crown's internal archive system, which maintained scanned copies of all third-party correspondence related to properties in its development pipeline, and had been careful enough to use a version of the signature that predated Jonah's most recent notary seal, which had been updated 18 months ago. The forgery was not amateur work. It was the kind of work that required both digital access and the knowledge that Jonah would not immediately discover the document existed. Jonah confirmed, without visible emotion, that he had not signed it, had never been presented with it for review and had never authorized any phase of the demolition process. He said this with the flat precision of someone who kept meticulous records, and then he pulled from his briefcase a dated receipt from a notary office showing that on the date the electronic authorization was supposedly created, he had been in a different city conducting a structural assessment of a bridge renovation for a municipal client, a fact that was verifiable, documented, and entirely incompatible with having signed anything in this building on that day. Vivian authorized the archive room search the same afternoon, overriding Chase's standing instruction that the room remain closed pending renovation preparation. The room was 3 doors behind the Bellweather Café, accessible through a corridor most guests never noticed, and it had been locked since November of the previous year. Inside it were the original construction drawings for the building's 1912 foundation, the real ones, the ones that predated the digital era and therefore could not be altered without physical intervention, and they showed something that Chase's structural reports had taken some care to obscure. The original load-bearing columns in the south wing were positioned at a different spacing than the ones depicted in the new demolition plans. The variance was small enough to be invisible in a summary presentation and significant enough to a structural engineer to completely change the risk calculation for any foundation work. If you used the real column positions, preservation was viable. If you used Chase's reported positions, it was not. The difference between the 2 columns of numbers was, conservatively, the difference between a $60 million restoration and a $200 million demolition and rebuild. And the second option was the one that required the contractor Chase's family investment vehicle was positioned to benefit from. Behind the drawings, in a filing box that had not been moved in at least a year, they found a printed list of 17 businesses that had occupied space in the building's commercial annex. 14 of them had signed lease termination agreements within a 20-month window. 9 of those agreements bore a common clause. The tenant acknowledged the termination was voluntary and waived the right to future claims against the property owner. Vivian recognized 3 of the businesses as ones whose owners had tried to reach her office directly and had been told by Chase's assistant that she was unavailable. She recognized 2 of the employee names on a separate sheet. People who had submitted internal complaints through Blackwood Crown's HR platform and had been categorized in handwritten notes on the printout as unreliable sources. Vivian stood in the archive room for a long time without speaking. Then she turned to Jonah and said she was sorry for the coffee, for the silence in the cafe, for every minute she had spent calculating the cost of speaking up instead of simply doing it. Jonah looked at her steadily and said that an apology had weight only when the person making it was willing to lose something to back it up. She asked what she would have to lose. He said, "Possibly your job." And then, before she could answer, her phone lit up with a message from Evelyn. Chase had called an emergency board session for the following morning, framed as a necessary governance review, and the agenda listed a motion to relieve Vivian of executive authority pending an independent performance audit. Chase chose Bellweather Café for the emergency session, and the choice was not accidental. He had worked in corporate environments long enough to understand that location carried meaning, that conducting Vivian's professional execution in the same space where the original confrontation had taken place would frame the entire story as a corrective, a return to order after an aberration, with Chase as the institution's immune response. He arrived first, arranged the seating so that his chair was centered and Vivian's was to the side, and briefed the 3 board members he had secured in advance with a presentation that described Jonah Vail in the language of calculated disruption. A man whose financial circumstances gave him obvious motive, whose legal position was fragile enough to collapse under a sustained challenge, and whose presence at the cafe had been orchestrated to create a reputational incident that could then be leveraged. The presentation was polished and the argument was coherent, and it had the kind of internal logic that convinces people who want to be convinced, which describes most rooms in which power is being consolidated. Chase produced an email that, he claimed, showed Jonah explicitly requesting an executive appointment on the project in exchange for his authorization. A consulting director role with a salary in the upper range of what a senior engineer might expect. The email was timestamped 5 weeks before the cafe meeting. It looked real. 3 of the board members leaned forward. One of the investors reached for the printed copy. Vivienne stood before the session was formally called to order and said that she had been present when Chase poured his coffee on a man who had done nothing to deserve it, and that she had not stopped it quickly enough, and that the environment in which a senior executive felt free to publicly humiliate a visitor in front of the company's CEO was not an environment that had developed by accident. It was one that the CEO had allowed to develop by consistently prioritizing the management of appearances over the enforcement of basic standards. She said this clearly, without apology for saying it, and one of the board members told her it was not the moment for self-criticism when the company was facing a legal challenge. Chase called it a display of weakness and suggested it confirmed that her judgment had been compromised. Then Chase demanded that Jonah prove he was not attempting to extort the company. Jonah did not make an emotional argument. He asked Evelyn, who had connected to the room's presentation system, to display the metadata from the email Chase had just submitted as evidence. The metadata showed the document had been created 11 days after the cafe meeting, 11 days after Jonah had already rejected the authorization and left the building. Evelyn read the timestamps aloud twice. The room was quiet in the specific way of people recalibrating. Jonah then put on the main screen a diagram he had built from 3 months of records, the contractor relationships, the investment vehicle, the shell companies, the timeline of lease terminations mapped against Chase's project phase approvals, and at the center of the diagram, a compensation structure that showed Chase had arranged a performance bonus, routed through a third-party consulting agreement that was contingent on the demolition option being selected over restoration. The money was not enormous by the standards of the room, but it was enough. It was enough to explain everything, and sometimes enough is worse than a large number, because it suggests that the betrayal was not even particularly ambitious, that a man had been willing to falsify records, coerce small business owners, forge legal documents, and publicly humiliate a private citizen for a bonus that would not have made him meaningfully richer. Chase sat across the table from the diagram, and his face went through several arrangements that none of them settled into anything coherent. He looked at Vivienne and reminded her, in a voice that had lost its previous register, that his family maintained relationships with the majority of the board. He said this not as a threat, but as a fact, the way people sometimes say things they know are already too late. The investment fund's representative had been sitting quietly through all of it, and now said, in the flat language of institutional fiduciaries everywhere, that the fund was suspending disbursements until Chase was removed from the project chain of command. Miles Fenwick stood up from a table near the window and placed his flash drive on the board chair's table without saying anything And then 4 other current and former staff members who had entered the cafe quietly in the past 20 minutes stood up in sequence. Vivienne looked at all of them. The people who had waited, each one believing they were the only one. And then she cast her vote to suspend Chase pending full investigation. She did it knowing 1 board member would abstain and 2 would vote against her, knowing the margin was 1 vote and that vote depended on the fund representative, knowing she might walk out of this cafe without her company. Chase looked at Jonah and said that regardless of how this vote went, Jonah was still a single father without the resources to outlast a corporate legal campaign, and that nothing that had happened today changed the fundamental arithmetic of their situations. Jonah placed the 2 halves of the torn signature page on the table. He said, "You still don't understand. I don't need to beat the whole company. I only need to stop the company from protecting you." The fund representative voted with Vivienne. The motion to remove her failed. The motion to suspend Chase passed by the same margin. When the room began to clear and the security officer asked Chase to surrender his access card, Jonah found a single line in the project folder that he had not noticed before. A trademark registration application filed 3 months earlier for the name Bellweather, submitted by a private hospitality group whose registration documents listed Chase Rourke as the founding member. He had been planning to demolish the cafe, take its name, and open his own restaurant on the ruins of the neighborhood he had spent 2 years dismantling. Vivienne ordered a full audit of Chase's transactions going back 5 years, and what the audit returned in the first 72 hours was sufficient for the company to move on every available front simultaneously. Chase was terminated with cause, which voided the severance structure he had negotiated 18 months before, and the stock option package he had vested over the past 3 years was clawed back under the fraud provisions in his employment agreement. The compensation Chase had arranged through the third-party consulting structure was recovered and placed into an escrow account, pending the financial regulator's review. The city's Construction Oversight Office opened its own inquiry into the unauthorized drilling that Jonah's sensor data had documented, and the insurance carrier, informed of the undisclosed contractor relationship, notified Blackwood Crown that Chase's conduct voided the coverage that had been in force during his tenure as development lead. The company issued a public statement that named the violations, described the corrective measures, and apologized by name to 3 business owners whose lease terminations had been obtained under false pretenses. Vivienne made the decision to release that statement over the objection of 2 board members who argued that specificity created legal exposure. She said that the company had already been exposed. The only question was whether it was going to acknowledge that exposure openly or spend the next several years having it documented for it by other people. Chase attempted to leave through the building's private exit on the day security collected his equipment and found that the access code had been changed while he was still in the board session. He walked the length of the ground floor past the cafe, past the counter where Miles Fenwick was restocking cups, past the bar where he had placed folded bills in front of Jonah Vale less than 2 weeks before, past the employees who had waited years to stand up in a room and did not look away from him as he passed. Nobody said anything. The silence was not organized or performative. It was simply what happened when a room full of people who had been afraid decided, without coordination, that there was no longer anything to be afraid of, and found the quiet that follows that kind of release. Chase stopped at the counter on his way out and was presented with a handwritten receipt from Miles for 1 medium dark roast, spilled 100% of the replacement cost, with a line at the bottom for the customer's signature. He paid it with his personal card. His company card had been deactivated at 9:47 that morning. Before he reached the door, Chase turned back and told Jonah that no matter what had happened in this building, Jonah would never fully belong in a room like this one. Jonah said, "You're right, because rooms like the one you built are too small for someone you can't buy." Miles watched Chase walk through the door, then turned back to the counter and began his afternoon prep, and the cafe returned to the comfortable, unhurried rhythm of a place that has been in continuous operation for a very long time and intends to continue. Vivian found Jonah at the bar an hour later and asked whether he would consider signing the restoration authorization. He looked at the two torn halves of the signature page, still sitting at the edge of his briefcase, and said the answer depended on what she chose to do after the press had moved on, and the board had settled, and there was no longer any public pressure requiring the right decision to be made out loud. Vivian did not wait for the press to move on. In the weeks that followed, she worked through each of the commitments Jonah had named in the cafe, not as crisis management, not as image rehabilitation, but as the kind of institutional work that produces no headlines and makes no one look heroic and is therefore the only reliable evidence of actual intention. She established a whistleblower channel, administered by an outside firm with no prior relationship to Blackwood Crown's legal department, and she funded it through a board resolution rather than an executive budget line, which meant no future CEO could quietly eliminate it. She personally reviewed the files of the 17 businesses that had been pressured out of the commercial annex and contacted each one directly to discuss what the company could do to correct the outcomes where correction remained possible. She had 3 conversations that were uncomfortable, 2 that required the company's lawyers to be present, and 1 that lasted 2 hours in a room without lawyers because the person on the other side of the table needed to be heard without documents between them. The redevelopment plan was revised. The demolition option was removed entirely and replaced with a phased restoration approach developed by an independent structural engineering firm, the same firm whose foundation analysis confirmed what Jonah's sensor data had already established. The original masonry was not only salvageable but properly maintained, would outlast the new construction by decades. The $600 million project budget was restructured accordingly, with the restoration of the historic foundation as the anchor of the design, rather than an obstacle to be removed. Bellweather Café remained in the building's ground floor, its lease renewed for 25 years at a rate that reflected the property's actual value rather than the inflated number Chase had used to justify the termination strategy. Vivian offered Jonah the role of independent director of heritage safety and structural integrity, reporting directly to the board rather than to the executive team, with a charter that explicitly included the right to publish his assessments without prior approval from management. The role was not symbolic. The contract included a clause that would have been unusual in any other negotiation. Jonah had the right to report violations publicly without the company's consent, which meant the company was formally accepting the possibility of being held accountable by the person it was hiring. Jonah read the contract twice, asked 3 questions about the reporting structure, and then asked Evelyn whether the board understood what they had signed. Evelyn said she had made sure of it. He signed the restoration authorization the same afternoon, with conditions attached that protected both the cafe's tenants and the employees who had come forward, and Blackwood Crown filed the authorization with the city within the hour. The project was back on schedule by the following Monday. Lila came by the cafe on a Thursday afternoon, a brief visit between her school's early release and a study group across town, and Jonah introduced her to Vivian in the uncomplicated way of a man who does not make a ceremony out of the important things. Lila shook Vivian's hand, told her the coffee smelled good, and then went to find a table near the window with her headphones and a textbook. Vivian watched her for a moment and then looked at Jonah and said she understood now why the work had mattered in the way it did. Jonah said he was not sure it was more complicated than it looked. Vivian set a fresh cup of coffee on the bar in front of him, placed it carefully, and asked whether he still thought he did not belong in a room like this one. Jonah looked at the bar where the money had been left, at the table from which the name card had been removed, at the door through which Chase had walked for the last time, and then he looked at the coffee sitting in front of him and said, "The table never decided who belonged at it. The way a person treats the one standing next to them always did." Behind them, Miles finished rehinging the original Bellweather Café sign above the counter, and below the old hand-painted lettering, in smaller letters that had not been there before, were the words, "Everyone is served the same." Miles stepped back, looked at it, and nodded once, the way a man nods when something has finally been returned to where it was always supposed to be. Weeks later, when someone asked Jonah how it felt to sit at the same bar where a man had poured coffee on him in front of a CEO, he said that the bar had not changed and the coffee was the same, and the only difference was that now, when he set his cup down, no one needed to explain to anyone else why it belonged there.